I'm back. So now we're on to chapter 12 of the Reluctant Regent, which is kind of continuing the little problem that we identified in the previous chapter, where somebody had made a deal with extra dimensional entities to gain power, which in general is a pretty bad idea, I would say. So I'm going to go ahead and get into it and read that chapter. And then there's actually only one more after this. So then we'll wrap up the book and then I can get into some other stuff that I wanted to talk about. So let me share my screen and get going here. So, chapter 12, Uninvited Guests. Well, actually, they kind of were. The formerly great Lord Tavish had left us in a bit of a pickle. There's no doubt about it. The fact that he didn't even have the wit to insist on my successful assassination before throwing the planar gates wide open to a demonic invasion just made the situation even more ridiculous than it already was. We didn't see any sign of demons yet, but we all knew with grim certainty that this state of affairs wouldn't last, so we planned accordingly. We sent the royal couple south with a large contingent of the more useless couriers to get them out of our hair, and Minra called up the lowlander clans. And then I sent a royal messenger to Thera, instructing her to mobilize the sheepish and send them to Admini. Elves talked to her sister shrouds, and they fanned out across the kingdom, searching for any sort of unnatural activity and arranging accidents for any demon cultists that they happened upon. Cyrene hired the Fry Maids to help garrison the city and coordinated the silvering of all weapon stores, along with the evacuation of the non-essential civilians from the area. We wanted to keep as many of our citizens out of demon gullets as possible. Midner decided we should carve silvered inspirational sayings into the city walls and gates, just on the off chance that would help repel the demons. For my part, I began feverishly researching the demonic invasion that had toppled the ill-found empire. But what I found wasn't reassuring. On the one hand, it was easy to identify where the demon host was going to break through because the site of the invasion that had destroyed the old empire was included in literally every history book on that event. The old breach point was located about a quarter league from Admini on top of a small hill, which our local farmers had, in typical pragmatic rural fashion, named Daemongate. They had also thoughtfully posted no trespassing signs around it, but this had the unintended and unfortunate side effect of turning the place into the most popular canoodling locale for the local youth. Teenagers, what can you do? The gate itself was a plain black stone arch about 10 spans wide, which gleamed unsettlingly in the sun. But it was otherwise rather innocuous for something that had helped destroy an entire civilization. I didn't, however, find much information on how to close said gate once it opened. The previous invasion had been stopped by clever lyrics and demonic short-sightedness, and somehow I didn't think that was going to work this time around. But I wasn't too worried, at least initially. After all, Admini was home to almost a dozen major temples to the divines, with powerful clergy, priceless religious artifacts, and thousands of fanatical followers who were probably just champing at the bit to sacrifice themselves in a spectacular fashion. So, despite our earlier lack of success with holy water, surely we could find some higher quality devout types who would be able and willing to help, right? Early the next morning, I called upon our local religious authorities to see what insights and aid they could offer in this gravest of crises. We met at the palace, where Cyrene had thoughtfully laid out a large breakfast to lure them in, and they were already making quite a dent in it when I arrived. Proctor Proctol, an immense whale of a man dressed in a rich ermine robe, was valiantly engaged in a life-or-death struggle with a cheese omelet, while his colleague, the diminutive High Hierophant Dracard, had already polished off one bottle of wine and was well on her way to finishing another. I thought if the demons could be tricked into engaging us in an eating or drinking contest with these worthies, I had no doubt that humanity would emerge victorious. After dodging a particularly high-velocity spray of omelet debris from the proctor, I began. So, I'm glad you could make it here today. The kingdom is faced with an existential crisis, a spiritual crisis, the likes of which we haven't encountered in generations. We're happy to help, the High Hierophant replied between gulps of wine. As servants of the divines, we are called upon to safeguard the souls of our flock whenever we are called on to do so, and it is a duty that we take quite seriously. I am only thankful that we live in a time where our services can be of use to humanity. Quite right, quite right. That's what we're here for, Proctal added before moving on from the now sadly diminished cheese omelet to a fresher and rather alarmed-looking roasted hen. Great, I said. This was going much better than I had anticipated. I'm glad you're willing to assist with this because, honestly, this is something I think is beyond the power of the Regency to resolve. The room quieted. Proctal began slowly gnawing on his chicken while Jacquard carefully placed her wineglass on the table. They glanced at each other. Yes, as we said, we'd be happy to serve in any capacity the kingdom needs us to, Jacquard said. Although you need to keep in mind that we're mere humans, not the divines themselves, she tittered nervously. Just out of curiosity, and only so that we know how best to offer our aid, what is the nature of the disaster that has befallen you? The Proctal asked in between bites. Well, here's the thing, I said. The late Lord Tavish apparently made a pact with a demon prior to his untimely death, and the terms of this agreement gave all of demonkind full access to the mortal realm. So, we're looking at the strong possibility that we'll be facing a full-scale demonic invasion, probably on the scale of the one that toppled the ill-found empire. And given that you're servants of the divines, and the divines are the sworn enemies of demonkind, this seems like something the clergy would be uniquely qualified to address. They both got several shades paler. I apologize, and just to be clear, but did you say demonic invasion? Asked the High Hierophant. I did, I replied. So, it's a major problem, as you can see. We'll definitely need the Divine's aid to get this sorted. I just don't think the city militia and my household guard are going to be sufficient. Proctor began making gagging sounds. He seemed to be choking on his chicken. Jacquard, on the other hand, just stared at me, her skin an odd ashen color. I walked around behind Proctor and began pounding him on his back. I found some interesting ideas from obscure histories on the destruction of the ill-found empire, I continued. But for something of this magnitude, I think the religious authorities would be better equipped to handle it. I have little training on the supernatural and am so at a bit of a loss on how to proceed. The semi-chewed wad of chicken finally shot from Proctor's mouth, and he sat back with a gasp. I walked back to my seat and added, So, this is why I'm glad we have such a large number of churches, shrines, and such. I assume you'll have no problems finding the resources and people to kick these foul creatures back to the hells that spawned them, right? There was dead silence for a moment. And then it began. We'd be delighted to help. Delighted, I say, said Jacquard. A chance to save the souls of the innocent is truly an opportunity set by the divines themselves. But I must admit that we do not have many militant types in our temples. She shrugged apologetically. But aren't you supposed to be ready to fight in the final battle between the divines and demonkind at the end of days? I asked. I distinctly remember hearing that repeatedly during every sermon I attended, usually right before the priest asked for our tithes. Who was all that money supporting if it wasn't going to the heroic Templars that are going to save humanity? Oh, missionaries, lecturers, teachers, philosophers, things like that, the High Hierophant said as she waved her hands airily, apparently trying to demonstrate the ethereal duties of these worthies. I felt yet another headache coming on. How precisely are theologians going to save everyone's souls from becoming demon fodder? Is the final battle going to be a debate, not an actual battle? Or maybe it's a lecture of some sort, one involving every sentient being on the plains. No, no, we think the final battle as more of a metaphor than an actual battle. But we also don't think it'll be a seminar either, she responded, a tad defensively, I thought. These people are valuable. They teach everyone to respect the divines and their servants. They're a vital part of kingdom culture. I'm sure that's wonderful, I said acidly, but we've got an actual battle to fight, and I don't think metaphysical arguments about the nature of the human soul are going to be of much use. I'd also like to point out that kingdom culture relies on having an actual kingdom and its citizens around to support it. Well, we've got some support staff, Proctol said, finally having gotten his breath back. Maybe they could help. Okay, that's good, I said. We can certainly use all the support we can get, especially if there aren't any actual Templars around. What sort of support can the Divine's representatives provide? We've got plenty of scribes, painters, tithe collectors, people like that, he said. I snapped. What in the Divine's postulant names is a tithe collector going to do to help stop a demon? I roared. Can they tax demons to death? Maybe they should charge them a toll every time they pass through the gate. Or, I know, maybe we should collect a tax every time they consume someone. That way, they should at least partially offset the loss of tax revenue we'll undoubtedly experience once our citizens start disappearing down demon gullets. But I wasn't done. I wasn't even close to being done. And painters? What good are they? I assume they'll paint moving scenes as we're all being devoured. Is that your plan? Or maybe they can paint everyone to look like demons, like camouflage. They'll never suspect it. We're saved. I'll bet those morons in the ill-found empire never thought of that, did they? I continued. But I forgot the most important group, scribes. They can get into bylaws wars with the demons, and they'll have a marked advantage because demons can't write. You know how I know this? Because I killed one yesterday, and it had such large claws that there was no way it could even grip a pen, much less properly enumerate the correct procedures for consuming humans. It's genius. The crisis has been averted. An uncomfortable silence fell as I panted in rage, my hands tightly gripping the arms of my chair so as not to fasten them on something else, like certain necks that were sitting across from me. After a moment, Proctol ventured timidly, are you joking? Because I can't really tell if you're being serious or not, especially about that bylaws thing. Of course I'm joking, I roared, surging up from my seat and taking a step towards the cowering priest. I'm a damn jester. I always joke, and there are few things funnier than watching an entire nation get eaten by demons. Am I right? Yes. No, he squeaked, shuffling frantically backward in his chair. I breathed heavily for a moment, then said quietly, Get out. And they did, expeditiously. And I learned something invaluable from this exchange, and that is the important difference between organized and true religions. Organized religions are all about sermons and sucking up resources to support an entire class of people who, even if they're not quite as useless as nobles, make up for it with their sanctimoniousness. They're renowned for creating art and building large, ornate temples. The more gold you can cram in them, the better. And they do that so that they can visually represent that a certain set of ideas, i.e., theirs, are present in this particular area, and to discourage others from spreading ideas which might ruin their good thing. Organized religions also do this because they assume that the common folk are too dim to figure out what they should believe. So, large buildings and constant haranguing is necessary to keep them in line. Various treatises and tomes are an inevitable part of this because priests and other members of this leisure class need something to debate, probably while sipping fine wine when everybody else has to work. Organized religions exist solely to perpetuate themselves and to enrich the clergy who operate them. If any soul saving goes on, it is purely accidental and probably quickly stopped lest it upset the system. A true religion is an entirely different thing because their adherents actually believe what they preach and then they work to make their ideology a reality, even if said ideology involves messily sacrificing people. They pop up every now and then, even amongst the most settled organized religions, because occasionally, thankfully very occasionally, some charismatic fool actually begins to believe what the priests tell them. And once they believe, then it's just a short jump to actually begin doing all the ridiculous things that the various holy texts and scrolls say you should be doing. And after you start doing these things and convincing others to do them, it's an even shorter jump to look over at people who aren't doing whatever you're doing and decide that if you have to do these silly things, then they should have to do them too. It's the equivalent of not wanting anyone else to have fun because you can't, even though you should be smart enough to figure out that maybe you shouldn't be doing these silly things in the first place. Any resistance leads almost inevitably to the usual human ways of resolving deep-seated problems, i.e., massacring each other. And this is the problem with true religions. They're uncontrollable because at their core they rely on a bunch of wacky ideas that lazy ne'er-do-wells created simply because they didn't want to work. You're just as likely to have a true religion convince its adherents to clean up a park as it is to have it decide that the people on the other side of the valley need to be burnt. Now, priests hate them because they interfere with their life of leisure, and pretty much everyone else who isn't drinking the same wine as the zealots usually ends up hating them too. But they have their uses, because whenever humans are facing an existential crisis, such as, say, a demonic invasion, they can convince otherwise rational people to do crazy things like throw themselves at slavering monstrosities, just on the off chance that they'll manage to hurt one. I suppose the rationale, if you can call it that, is that at least their souls will be saved once the unpleasantness of being consumed is finished. Unfortunately, the kingdom had an organized religion. Or was that fortunately? It's very confusing at times. At any rate, there would clearly be no help coming from our priests, so I was back to square one. At least the garrisoning and provisioning of the city proceeded smoothly, so that was one less thing to be concerned about. Over the next few weeks, the sheepish arrived, along with as many lowland or clanspersons and frymaids as could be spared. I spent my days and most of my nights poring through the obscure texts on arcane rituals, first-person accounts of the destruction of the ill-found empire, and tomes of demonology of dubious worth and provenance, written by people with wildly different levels of sanity. But none of them had anything useful to say. In desperation, I even delved into the late king's illicit collection of erotic goblin poetry looking for answers, but all that did was convince me that a significant segment of the population might actually be improved by a demonic invasion. And just when the last few precious shreds of my energy had evaporated, the nobility, with their usual impeccable sense of timing, decided that pending demonic invasion provided the perfect opportunity to start agitating about the circumstances surrounding the late Lord Tavish's untimely demise. They were led by a withered old hag named Dame Lucille, who had apparently decided that being thrown into a bush at that ill-fated party had somehow given her special insights into what had happened. They began congregating, and as an aside, it's never a good idea to let nobles congregate outside of committee meetings. But I digress. They began congregating, and soon all sorts of wild rumors began making the rounds through Admini's upper crust. I wanted his land, so I had him killed. Cyrene and he were lovers, and I killed him in a fit of jealous rage. Or, my personal favorite, I wanted to marry the princess, and somehow Lord Tavish had foiled my nefarious attempt to do so. And this last one perfectly illustrates how ridiculous and fact-averse most gossip is, because not only were Dyrannus and I both happily married at this point, but it was a rare day indeed when the princess and I were even in the same building, much less the same room. One wonders how they thought I'd manage to woo the princess if I never saw her, and how in the divine's name I could pull off such a plot when I was married to Cyrene, who was the most observant and least foolish person in the kingdom. I humored them enough to create a special commission to investigate these dubious claims, and then I promptly added about 50 of the most troublesome nobles to it, thus ensuring that they stayed out of my hair and didn't cause too many problems. And this was a relief, because Moose became increasingly good-natured, which led me to suspect that time was running out. And a few days later, I was proven right. Daemongate opened at midnight, when a violent storm suddenly blew up a few leagues south of Admini. Cyrene and I were woken by a loud crack, as if the foundations of the world had broken open, which, in point of fact, they had. Low rumbling followed, like something ancient and unbearably heavy was being dragged aside, and then the entire horizon flashed with reddish-white lightning. The night was strangely hot and still, and had none of the usual moist ozone smell that accompanied normal thunderstorms. Also, the storm clouds stayed over the Daemongate and weren't moving at all, which, call me crazy, seemed like a bad sign. The alarm bells in the watchtowers along the wall began clanging, and the shouts of the garrison as they rushed to their posts echoed strangely over the otherwise dark and silent city. Cyrene and I got dressed, then we went to the window in our bedchamber and looked towards the Daemongate. Full moon shone weakly behind the clouds, illuminating the surrounding countryside in a dim, shimmering light, and we could see a strange, dark mist swirling on the top of that cursed hill. Pinpricks of reddish-orange flame sparked within the mist, and the entire mound was soon shrouded from view. Earlier we had cordoned it off, mainly to keep randy youths out and demons in, and I saw the small garrison that we'd stationed there riding madly towards the dubious safety of the city walls. But more alarmingly than the open of the transdimensional breach was the procession of brightly dressed individuals, glittering with gold, silk, and gems, that sallied forth from the rapidly closing gates and trooped towards the now mist-shrouded hill. They were mounted on a variety of richly caparisoned steeds. I don't know if I pronounce that right. Caparisoned? I think that's right. Most of which seemed less than enthusiastic. And there was even a handful of massive carriages included that promptly got stuck once they left the road, leaving their occupants to hurry after their compatriots on foot. At the head of this unorganized mob was what looked like an enraged mummy in a skin-tight red silk gown, riding a jewel-encrusted chariot pulled by a plump, if depressed-looking, white pony. Dame Lucille had finally left the city. And when I first saw them, I thought the kingdom nobility had at last found some deeply buried reserve of strength and resolve, and they were riding out to meet the demons in a courageous but ill-advised attempt to stop the incursion at its source. But then I reconsidered. These were, after all, nobles, so there had to be a self-serving and short-sighted purpose at play here. I had no idea what that purpose might be, and as the last of the Daemongate garrison made it safely through the city gates, I lost interest in riding after them just to find out. As it happened, we later discovered that the committee seeking answers to the untimely murder of the great and honorable Lord Tavish, that's CSAUMGHLT for short, had undergone an ill-timed spasm of efficiency. They had decided, under Dame Lucille's venomous guidance no doubt, to ally themselves with the invaders to, quote, safeguard the rights of the pure-blooded families of the kingdom, end quote. And, that's exactly their words, not mine. With the myopia typical of people who inhabit the rarefied realm of the Adminisphere, they took it upon themselves to greet their supposed liberators in person and to provide them with the guidance necessary to crush the rest of us as quickly and as painfully as possible. The results, of course, were predictable to anybody but them. The last of the glitterati quickly vanished into the mist, and we didn't see them again, although pieces of them turned up regularly for years after the invasion. After giving me a quick peck on the cheek, Cyrene bustled off to make sure that the watchtowers were properly supplied with silver bolts, and I trudged back to the library to see if there was anything that could help us stem the tide. I was still there hours later when Kells arrived to tell me that the first of the endless hordes had arrived at our walls. I rushed back to my chambers to arm myself, and as I was struggling into my battle-worn gambeson, why is my armor shrinking? I thought irritably. I noticed that Kells had a mischievous grin on her face. What's wrong? I asked as I finally managed to buckle the heavy coat around my stomach. You're in a cheerier mood than usual, considering that we've got a horde of transdimensional horrors outside the walls. Kells burst out laughing and jumped off the table she was sitting on. Wait till you see them. They're so silly. I frowned at her as I picked up my trusty crossbow and a couple of quivers of silver bolts. How can they be silly? I asked while I strapped the quivers to my belt. Demons are supposed to be the embodiment of horror and hunger. That doesn't seem silly to me. Ha! That may be, but these ones are obviously out of practice. You'll see what I mean. We're at the main gatehouse whenever you're ready. I'll see you there. And with that, she skipped off down the hallway, whistling cheerfully as she usually did before mass carnage ensued. Wondering how exactly a demon could look silly, I finished gearing up, then headed outside. I guess I'd find out. I arrived at the gatehouse tower to find Kells casually sitting on the battlements, flipping the silvered knitting needle she now used as weapons into the air. She pointed at something beyond the walls to Cyrene and giggled. And I should point out that Minrir was elsewhere doing Minrir types of things, so he missed the entire following exchange, much to his chagrin. The soldiers manning the walls were snickering and nudging each other too, so this clearly wasn't a case of Kells's bloodthirsty sense of humor manifesting itself. Okay, what's so funny about these demons? I said as I walked up. I looked over the battlements and gaped in astonishment. And then I began laughing. By the divines, you weren't kidding. What on earth were they thinking? Don't they realize what those are? Milling around outside the walls was a horde of demons. They were tall and short, skinny and fat, had many arms and/or tentacles or only a few, wide gaping maws filled with needle-like fangs or orifices scattered about their slimy skin that dripped various unwholesome fluids onto the ground. And ordinarily this would have been a horrifying sight, but the demons had apparently encountered the delegations of nobles on their way to negotiate treason, again with predictable results. And the demons had decided to appropriate various bits and pieces of their wardrobe in an attempt to give us poor mortals a view of the terrible fate that awaited us in the not too distant future. It was intended to be a horrific spectacle, but in reality, it was anything but. I saw demons wrapped in silk dresses several sizes too small for them, demons with fine boots stuck on their various appendages, demons with fashionable hats affixed to what I assumed were their nether regions, although it's difficult to tell sometimes with demons, and even a few with stylishly colorful pants wrapped around their heads. But by far my favorite, however, was a tall, slimy-skinned monstrosity who had somehow managed to cram itself into Dame Lucille's corset. This demon was clearly some sort of leader because it oozed from the horde to address us. Humans, it burbled, your doom is upon you. I, solicitous, says this is to you so you can prostrate yourselves before us and welcome your utter destructions. Then it stopped, clearly waiting for some sort of terrified response from us poor doomed humans huddled helplessly behind our battlements. And I tried to respond, truly I did, but at this point I was laughing so hard that I couldn't even catch my breath, much less address the trans-dimensional monstrosity standing below. It looked like some sort of gray-skinned burrito, with slime oozing from both ends of the bright red corset, while a wide variety of claw-tipped tentacles flailed uselessly both above and below the straining fabric. It was truly a testament to demonic resilience that it could even breathe, much less talk. After a few moments, it slurped out, "Open your gates and give yourselves to us. Abase yourselves, and we shall make your inevitable death swift." A low rumble of discontent roiled through the misshapen mob behind it, causing it, with some difficulty, remember, it had a corset on, to twist around and glare at its comrades. The effect was somewhat ruined by the fact that one of its glaring eyes was mounted on the top of its head, while the other was stared fixedly at the ground between its stumpy legs. But I suppose it's the thought that counts in situations like this. It turned back to us after a moment and amended its previous threat. "We shall make your death last no more than 1 day each. And that's final," it roared at the still grumbling crowd behind it. And they slowly quieted under the threatening weight of its glare. Again, I assume, because I couldn't really tell what it was looking at. I did, however, think that it was unlikely that an inoffensive clod of dirt, or a wispy cloud high in the skies, cared how long it took to eat us. So it stands to reason that it was addressing its demonic comrades. Again, like I said, it's always hard to tell with demons, though. I finally managed to get myself under control, and after wiping my watering eyes, I stepped to the battlements. Yes, thank you for clarifying what you're here for, Solesis, whatever your name is. Solesis, whatever, I said, cutting it off mid-roar. I can't be arsed to memorize any demon lane longer than three consonants, because if I did, we'd be here all day just getting through our opening statements. So, let me say this. There will be no eating of anyone or anything here today. Instead, you will turn around and hie your fashionable, there was muffled laughter from the battlements at this, hides back to whatever hells you sleazed up from. Pick up any trash you left behind and don't come back. This is the only warning you'll get, and you have 30 heartbeats to comply. With that, I stepped back, loaded my crossbow with this wickedly spiked silver bolt, and began counting. Why, you insolent insects, it began. You will address me by my name, or I will eat your eyes whilst you screams. It droned on and on in that vein, its corset creaking alarmingly whenever it took a breath, while I waited patiently for its time to expire. After what I thought was enough time, I looked at Kells and asked, What do you think? Was that 30 heartbeats? Close enough, she shrugged. It's starting to repeat itself, so you'd better wrap this up or we'll be here all day. Besides, I'm getting bored. Right, I responded. It was never wise to let Kells get bored. I stepped up to the battlements, took careful aim, and shot the slavering monstrosity right between the eyes. Or where its eyes would have been if it was a normally proportioned creature. Actually, I confess I'm not quite sure where I shot it, but it was somewhere towards the upper end of the slimy mass that was protruding from the top of the by now much abused corset. Anyway, the result was most satisfactory. The demon let out a startled glarp, stiffened, and slumped lifelessly to the ground. A cheer sounded from the soldiers on the walls. The demons roared in fury, and then they surged forward. And with that, the general mayhem and confusion that characterized the siege of Admini began in earnest. Yeah, so now we've got a demonic invasion. Um, I don't know if my thoughts on organized religion are going to be uh, controversial. I don't know. But I do think that there is a very big difference between a religion that is organized around buildings and hierarchies and things like that, and a religion that's kind of more personal and true, I guess, for lack of a better term. Um, but I don't assign value to that because I do think organized religions, they give you, they serve as a way of giving you sort of a cultural framework for what we consider ethical and good behavior. And personal religions, kind of do the same thing, although it's, internalized to individuals. And there's obviously interplay between the two of them. But I will say this, and I'll leave it at this, that religion is value neutral. It can be good or bad, depending on how you use it. And that goes for both of them. If you've internalized a value system that involves, I don't know, choking squirrels to death, actually, that might be a good one now that I think about it. You get my point, though. Uh, the net thing that you bring to the world is going to be negative, dark, cold. You're like taking joy from people. On the other hand, if your internal religion has you cleaning up trash or something like that, that's a net positive. So I think our talk about this, and this is why I included it in the book, tends to be too unidimensional. Um, so religion and ethics are other systems. So you got to kind of take them in the context of how they're impacting the world around you before you start making value judgments. And again, keep in mind that could change by time too. Nobody's going to be ethical all the time, unless you're some sort of supernatural entity, in which case, why the hell are you hanging around here? But anyway, that's kind of the ideology I was trying to impart um, with that. And then a little dig at the end there about like just again how thoughtless, sheltered oligarchs are about dealing with any sort of existential crisis that doesn't fit into their worldview. So that's that. I might actually try doing the last chapter chapter next to last. I think I've got 2 left today. So we'll see how my voice feels. But I'm going to go and wrap this one up here.